CEU Medieval Radio, Past Perfect, the talk show about medieval and early modern culture.
Hello and welcome to Past Perfect, CEU Medieval Radio's podcast on everything medieval and early modern. My name is Michał Machalski, and I am joined here in studio by three wonderful minds. Can I ask you all to introduce yourselves?
Mm-hmm. So I'm Éloïse Adde. I'm assistant professor at CEU, specialist of the medieval history, medieval nation.
I'm Cathleen Sarti. I teach early modern history at the University of Oxford.
I'm Len Scales, Professor of Medieval History at the University of Durham.
Thank you very much. Eloise, we are speaking on 5th of May, 2023, the last day of the conference you organized at CEU under the title Community and Identity Individuals, Shaping of the Political Nation in Premodern Europe. How did the idea of conference came to be?
This idea comes from my work, because originally I was working on the first Chronicle written in Czech, where there is a strong sense of the nation. So developed against the Germans, who are mostly burghers. So it was the origin of my reflection on the nation. And during a project that I'm continuing now, I'm comparing Brabant and Bohemia. And so I wanted to invite several persons from different countries, areas, and interests in order to open this comparative reflection on the birth of the emergence of the nation in late medieval period. And so the aim of this conference, it's not only to compare different case studies, but from this also to offer an understanding of what could be a nation if it exists in the medieval period. And this idea, it was also not, so the aim of this conference is not to prove the modernity of the Middle Ages, because the nation is associated to the modernity in the traditional doctrine dedicated to this concept. So it's not to say, oh, look at the Middle Ages, you are also very modern like me, but because at least when scholars are speaking of the nation in the 19th, 18th century, speaking about a notion, a concept which is already the norm, already an evidence, and they are not looking at the premises, how this nation emerged, in which context it is. Because what is important is not just to say, oh, the nation is constructed, but it's also really to finally analyze, compare the different words used, the different contexts where it emerged, in order to really understand its meaning, function, because at least nation has a function. That is what the conference was aimed at understanding.
One can say that this is a topic that brings in together medievalists interested in all of medieval Europe. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking, because you're working on medieval Bohemia, but our guests work on late medieval Scandinavia and late Holy Roman Empire. What brought you, how do you see this problem of modern or pre-modern? This discussion between modern and pre-modern nation?
Well, it's a good question, and when Eloise first approached me to take part in the conference, I almost said no. I've done medieval nations. I wrote a book a long time ago, back in 2012, called The Shaping of German Identity, which tried to look at the emergence of ideas of a common German identity during the Central and later Middle Ages. It was a long book. It took me a very long time to write. And I thought I'd moved on from all that, and I'm currently working on a rather different project on the mythologization of medieval emperors in Germany between the Middle Ages and the present day. So I've almost stopped working as a medievalist and become very interested in modern sources. I've found myself working in archives. I've found myself even doing some oral history, which has been very exciting and very strange. And I thought, this is all a very long way away from the medieval nation, and that's kind of in the past. But then I thought again, First, because I think it's really exciting that medievalists are still interested in this subject, and the opportunity to come to a conference in Vienna always has an attractiveness to it. And I cast my mind back to when I started as a student, back in 1984. I remember sitting in a lecture given by the great Ian Kershaw. Ian Kershaw started out as a medievalist and turned himself into the biographer of Hitler. And he taught a first-year lecture course at my university on state and nation in modern European history. And I think almost his first words in his first lecture were, we start this course in 1500 because there weren't any states or nations before 1500. And I remember as a naive first year sitting and thinking, it can't be that simple because nothing in history ever is. Back then, modernists, historians of the modern period, were very dismissive of the idea that there could be anything called the nation before modernity. And medievalists, when they engaged with the subject at all, engaged with it in a rather naive way, going to their sources and saying, look, here is a word for a people or a nation, so clearly they existed. There wasn't very much going on. And then at the end of the 20th century, nationalism, I suppose, kicked off again with war in Yugoslavia, with the rise of religious nationalism in the Middle East. And suddenly it was a hot topic that medievalists were talking about. Modernists were actually starting to listen to medievalists and to suspect that there was some common ground between them. So it's remained a very exciting topic. And clearly nationalism is not irrelevant to what's going on in Europe and on the borderlands of Europe at the moment. So the opportunity to come back and talk about that was very exciting. But I also started to think about my current work on these 19th and 20th century Germans getting excited about medieval emperors, and started to think, well, why were they doing this? Well, they were doing it because they thought that the Middle Ages and the medieval Holy Roman Empire that I work on, or that I used to work on, was crucially important to the origins of the modern German nation. So it struck me that perhaps trying to use these German nationalist writings of the 19th and 20th centuries not simply as bad history to be set aside, certainly they're problematic history, but to use them as a lens through which to read the medieval sources, not in order to take at face value what these nationalist historians of 19th and 20th century Germany are saying, but to compare and contrast what they think they can see in the sources and what we, as I would hope in many ways post-nationalist medievalists, when we read those same sources, what we think we see. I think there's a heuristic value in still reading this 19th and 20th century nationalist historiography of the Middle Ages to help sharpen our own perceptions of what we think's going on around nation-making and community formation in this medieval period.
In certain sense, it is quite easy when you're working with Holy Roman Empire just because of how powerful the question of nation appears in German historiography in the 19th and 20th century. And I wonder, Kathleen, how does it look like in Scandinavia?
Yeah, so of course, being a German, I'm also impacted by all these national discourses. And when I came to Scandinavian history, I came through the lens of the positions in the early modern period and state formation. And the thing with Scandinavian history is a bit that it's really difficult to pinpoint political communities in some ways, because we have strong national ethnicity, we have a strong national historiography writing in the 19th, 20th century. At the same time, especially in the 19th century, but also in the 15th and 16th century, so in the period I'm researching, we have this idea of a shared identity, of Scandinavism. Scandinavism is a term we're researching. So there is always a tension between being Swedish, being Norwegian, being Danish, being Icelandic, being from the Faroe Islands, and being a part of a Scandinavian culture, which is different from the continental culture and which is also different from an Anglo-Saxon culture, and which I also realized on the discussions during this conference, which is different from a lot of the Roman Empire Latin culture. because Roman Empire didn't reach Scandinavia, simply as that. Mm-hmm. So coming from this period, there is a tension already in the late Middle Ages and the early modern periods, where people trying to understand how they belong together. And the early modern period makes it even more complicated because all of these separate kingdoms, as we understand them today, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, had territories which were outside of Scandinavia. So Finland was a core part of the Swedish monarchy, but it's not Scandinavia. So the same goes in the late medieval period. Northern Estonia, or today's Northern Estonia, was part of the Danish part. We have Greenland, we have possessions still in what is today Scotland, from the Norwegian kingdom. And they all have to come together. And of course we have in Denmark had partly rule and authority over parts of Schleswig and Holstein, which is a really, really complicated case in terms of national identity, which of course had huge impact in the 19th century for the German nation building and a German state building.
Eloise, it's almost impossible not to talk about High Roman Empire, its German or non-German character, and not to include in it the question of Czechs. And what is your perspective as a historian of medieval Bohemia?
Maybe what I wanted to react, you both mentioned the importance of how you, especially you marked by the German historiography, and I think that it's something that at least we are all concerned with that. And so the aim of such a comparative approach is also not just to compare different situations, but also maybe to make us aware of this and maybe make us try to find a common field of discussion and of understanding of the nation. Because when I was working on Bohemia, I was also at least marked by this, the Czech historiography, because I was working with the material which was already published and on this field, and I was so there is this tendency to present the exceptionality of the and it's at least it belongs to all historiographies and all countries, all cultures to present themselves as exceptional, and I don't think that is ideological. It's just there is this concentration, and at least there is not so many foreigners or working, for example, on the Czech history. So Czech historians are working all together. They are not comparing with other. And it's not ideological. It's just a kind of sedimentation. They're all always speaking together, and so they consolidate this idea that it's very special. And then when I moved to Luxembourg, because of I was hired there as a postdoc, I discovered another historiography, but it was also in the same Holy Roman Empire, and it was very interesting for me to see also this the Luxembourgs who were ruling Luxembourg and Bohemia, so had a lot of connections. So I started to work with other material, other sources, and it led me to the history of Brabant. So I was working. I started to work on chronicles produced in the towns in Brabant, and so still my chronicles produced in the nobility in Bohemia, and so I could observe similar mechanisms, but using a totally different structure. I mean, in terms of social, because the Bohemia is marked by more dominance of the nobility, and Brabant that of the towns, but at least very similar processes, and that's what I think that in order to better understand the emergence, to see that some mechanisms are very similar, but are used in different configurations, different, also with connected to different values, also in different historical contexts. Sometimes the useful enemy is very present, sometimes less. It's what I started to want to put together in order to understand better kind of concept of the operative concept of the nation.
I think that it lends itself very well to the question of what similarities did all of you find, maybe something that surprised you in research of other participants of the conference that did resonate very strongly with your own research or the results of your own studies.
I think one of the things that struck me, and it in some ways connects with the observations that Eloise was making a moment is how similar the language of difference is across medieval Europe. So it's striking how different peoples and different groups and imagined communities across medieval Europe believe in their own exceptionalism, but they talk about their own exceptionalism in very similar ways. It seems to me that it points to a paradox in medieval culture and to perhaps an interesting question for historians of the medieval nation, which is how a society which claims to embrace universal cultural values, because insofar as Christianity is the dominant culture and the culture of the ruling elites in medieval Europe, this is a universal set of values. St. Paul famously observed that there is in Christ no distinction between slave and free, Greek and Jew. So, if we're talking about a single community under the church as organisation and as body concerned with the salvation of all, how is it that we find a world so bound up in discourses about difference and discourses about exceptionalism? And it seems to me there is an interesting paradox there. There are elements in that paradox that point to the nature of that Christian culture itself and that Judeo-Christian culture. It's striking, for example, how widespread the model of the chosen people is across the length and breadth of Western Europe, from the Franks to the English to the Bohemian. All these peoples persuade themselves, or their elites and spokespersons persuade themselves, that this nation has a special place in the divine universal plan. Sigmund Freud, I think, talked about the narcissism of small difference. And it seems to me that one of the things that is going on in medieval Europe is a world of, in some ways, cultural sameness, and in some ways, growing cultural sameness, with, in some ways, a standard university education developing across the High Middle Ages, learning to talk about difference, and talking about difference on the basis of an increasingly standardized, across Europe, set of cultural norms and values and templates and stereotypes.
Maybe to add to this, one thing which struck me is that they're talking about the same thing, but often using very different words. And I think this is a challenge also for us as historians, not just between languages, but also, of course, between times, and taking really the notion of what are they meaning with each term and how does this translate into another society of the same time, or how does it translate to the modern times. Obviously, we're very much agreed on that the 19th century nation state is not something we can find before the 19th century. But this concept and this term is still useful, but needs to have a very detailed-oriented approach, maybe.
And to follow up, I think that it's not just to compare different countries, different times, but within a country, different discourses, competing discourses, because as we could see during this conference, that the emergence of the nation is also connected to, embedded in struggles, social struggles within the different polities or countries concerned. And so you could have, so the same mechanisms are used by different groups. And here, so each group tries to impose his own narrative, his own concept, because it's connected to its own existence, its own assertiveness to impose itself as the dominant group. So I think that it's also something which should be taken into account. And this conference showed that extremely beautifully.
Yeah, I think we had this notion out, especially on a paper given on late medieval France, where when the idea is out, it can be used by different parties to negotiate and to legitimize their whatever they want.
Because what is also very interesting is if we follow a little bit, maybe I will be very schematizing and caricatural, but if we follow the emergence of the use of the nation, at the very beginning, it's present in this historiographical programs developed by the rulers who try to embody this nation. But at that time, it's rather a kind of glorification, and so attract the recognition of the people through the glorification and the desire to be a part of this glorified construction. And then, so the elites, so different elites, so maybe I'm very caricatural, but it's just to give a pattern. Or so the nobility or the towns, depending on the, also try to use these different tools, and progressively and these elites, so they put more the accent in the idea that they are embodying I think more than the rulers, the interests of all. Even though it's also then the rulers also want to embody this idea of common good, but I think that at the very beginning it was more a tool, or maybe in my context, developed by these different elites. And then as they develop this idea that they represent, and it's not just glorification, it becomes something bigger, that they are here, they embody because they use that to say, they embody the interests of all, which means they have their support. But then you generate some expectations. And so, it's structuring all these different parts of the society together. I think that it's a process which is very clear in the different, and it has sometimes maybe different, genealogies. Maybe sometimes it's at one moment it's rather the nobility which is stronger, depending on the different countries, and the discourses won't be so totally similar, and the words used are different, but there is this mechanism of inclusion, at least through this use of the nation. At least it has the consequence is inclusion of the rest of the society progressively in a kind of public space also. I think that this idea of nation can't be addressed without speaking of public space.
And if you're really unlucky as a ruler, you establish an idea of the nation, which is then used to depose the ruler.
Yeah, for example, at least we could see that. Yeah.
Could you actually speak a little bit more on that, which was the subject of your presentation?
Yeah, so I worked intensely on depositions and wrote my first book about it, comparing Scandinavia and the British Isles. And one thing is definitely, and I talked about Scandinavia in the 15th, 16th century, where we do have strong identification of, it's not really clear who we are yet, but through conflicts with the ruler, we define who we not are. So the Swedes slowly decide during the 15th century that they are not Danish, even though they are in a personal union with Denmark and Norway, and usually under the Danish king, who is also then the king of Sweden and the king of Norway in this construct of the Kalmar Union. And the Swedes tend to depose the Union king because he doesn't really fit this idea they developed also under these rulers of being part of the Swedish realm and law. And this is something which came up in my sources very often. The realm and the law, and the king has to not just embody them, but also be under this law and not go against it. So there is a kind of positive identification of a community with a structure and with a certain legal identity, which becomes much more than also connected with an ethnic identity. And in the sources, it's said the king poured in Danish forces, and these Danish forces were foreign and they ruled with tyranny and violence. And that's not how it's done in the Swedish realm and given by the Swedish law. So I found this very interesting. And I think this idea of legal culture and this idea of foreignness is something which was addressed also very often in this conference.
I want to go back to something that was said about the universality of underlying values that found themselves grounded in Christian thought, and speak a little bit about the universality of language in which those values were expressed, mainly Latin. And I wonder, because during the conference we've talked a lot about Latin and vernacular languages, and we also talked a lot about the terms that we use to talk or not to talk about nation or communities in those languages. So how does this commonality of terms like natio or gens help us or impedes us as scholars of medieval Europe in precisely those kind of comparative forums on the development of national identity?
I think they're a stimulus. I think they're very exciting, and they're a problem that we grappled with throughout the conference without, I think, entirely reaching a solution. And I think that's absolutely fine and not something that we need to apologise for, because it's a difficult matter on which to reach a solution, and it points to something which I think is at the heart of medieval studies and at the heart of why medievalists do what they do, in my opinion, which is this tantalising relationship between the Middle Ages and what comes after, and the way in which, I think for many of us who study the Middle Ages, the excitement of the period is that it's in some ways utterly different from modernity, and in other ways it resembles modernity and speaks to modernity. And I think that's the challenge of a conference like this one, and it's the challenge of attempting to study extremely current terms and concepts like nation and peoplehood through a language which, in the case of many of our sources, isn't our language because it's the Latin language, and to figure out not only what the people using these terms mean, but how it relates to what we mean when we talk about nation, and how the ideas and the sentiments and the motivations to action, which are reflected in those medieval sources, relate to what modern people do when they engage with the concept of nation. And I think figuring out what that difference is, and it's not a fixed difference, it's a changeable difference between the Middle Ages and modernity, between then and now, between a pre-modern society with a universal elite language, which isn't ours, but many other languages too, and many other forms of communication, not all of them verbal forms of communication. How we relate that to, Eloise a moment ago used the term public sphere. Well, Jürgen Habermas talked about the public sphere, and Habermas thought it was something that only emerges in the Europe of the 18th century, when people start drinking coffee and going to coffee houses and reading newspapers. I think medievalists might have a few responses to Habermas and suggest that people were getting together and being sociable and talking and exchanging news and having opinions and communicating with one another long before the era of the European coffee house. So it's that then and now question. And given that there clearly was a discourse of identity and community and peoplehood in the Middle Ages, and there is one now, and that some things have changed, but some things haven't changed, and some things are very recognisable across the centuries. How you put all that together, I think that's a really exciting challenge.
Maybe to react to this, because scholars like modernists working on the idea of nation, they are working, when they decided that it emerged in the 19th century, they are at least working with a nation which is already totally dominant. It became the normal way of organization. But the nation did not appear ex nihilo at the end of the 18th century. It's totally wrong to think like that. And I think that the challenge of speaking about the nation in the Middle Ages, it's also to try to understand why such a discourse started to be useful, why did it get a function, how the nation started to be a fundamental political factor, like in the different political struggles. So some choices were made, and the nation was not the dominant way of organization, not also the dominant means of identification, but it's here. And it starts to be something very important in the political struggle. And so I think that here we can maybe not only understand better the Middle Ages when we are dealing with this, but also better understand the nation today, its meaning. So I think really you spoke about how we have our own concepts or words, and medieval people have also their own concept and word. But still, I think that we are working with our own categories and we have to deal with that and to confront, to adapt our vocabulary to the medieval society. But it doesn't mean also to just work on medieval words. I think what is very interesting is to, thanks to our also to our concepts, maybe to organize the different words used in the different medieval sources, and to because maybe the concept of the nation is never very clear, so we have to also deconstruct all the theory on the nation created by the modernists, also to better construct all these different ways how the nation could be expressed in medieval societies and medieval sources.
From the conference and from also what you just said, and we had this discussion, I was really, really impressed to see the impact and the influences also of the different literature which were developed and established in the Middle Ages, and especially thinking about these concepts, for example, in Czech literature, which Éloïse, you have worked on quite a lot, but also Croatian literature and the impact of different writing systems. And as someone from the 21st century, we would think there's kind of like an exclusion between these languages and between these different literature. And I think what this conference showed that there isn't, that there is a lot of overlap, that there's a lot of talking and understanding of each other, which of course I see also in the Scandinavian region, if you're not just Scandinavia, but also Baltic region, which has this very strange political organization form of the Hanseatic League. And they bring with them their own language, or not their own language, but they bring with them Low German as a lingua franca, which is understood in all the coast towns in Scandinavia and in the northern coasts of Europe, the Netherlands. And Low German is not the same as any of the Scandinavian languages, but it's still, they understand each other. And they play off each other and they influence each other in different languages, in different literatures, and even in different writing formats, styles.
I think one of the things that emerged for me from the conference was the usefulness of nation as a concept to think with in the Middle Ages and to think about the Middle Ages through, which is not to suggest that nations or nation-like structures are ubiquitous in the Middle Ages, far from it. But I think by starting to think through the concept of the nation, you shine a light on those things in the Middle Ages that are not the nation, or are perhaps not the nation, but that we perhaps see in a slightly different way when we start to ask questions about the nation. So, for example, is the city a nation? Well, in one sense, clearly, no, it certainly doesn't resemble what we imagine by the nation. But take, say, the Republic of Florence in the 15th century. It has a collective history. It has an origin myth. It has an elite collective memory of its own special status. It has its own language, certainly its own dialect. Florentines can recognize one another by the way that they speak. It has its own familiar topography, its own skyline. It stands out on the horizon to the traveller coming home. So how is the Kingdom of France a nation and the City and Republic of Florence not a nation? Does a nation have to have a king? How do we deal with those institutions that are horizontal rather than vertical? Catherine just spoke of the Hanseatic League. The Hanseatic League draws on ideas of common Germanness. The Hanseatic League even occasionally invokes the legacy of the Roman Empire. But the Hanseatic League is an alliance of towns. It's manifestly not a kingdom. It's not in that sense, conventional medieval political structure, and it's not something that conventionally resembles a modern nation either. So as a starting point, in some ways a crude and difficult to use starting point, but nevertheless a starting point for thinking about community and society and hierarchy and association in the Middle Ages. The nation, I think, showed itself in this conference to be as fruitful and as effective a point from which to start out on that journey as any.
As we've learned, you can see some of the nations from the windmills, right? You can glance your sight at all of the nation. So it spans from Heimat to an empire or even the universal Christendom. Yes?
Yeah, to follow up on this question of if a city can be a nation or not, I would say, like you, at least a city can be a nation or a duchy or a small. But in the practice, and I think that this conference also showed that very well, this encounter or between the contingents, the different historical processes, and the emergence of a kind of norm. Then, because as you said, yes, the city-state of Florence or Venice were very powerful and could be at a certain moment be a nation. But as Susan Reynolds pointed, at a certain moment the kingdom became the archetype of the nation. And here, at least we can come back to one of the points you developed before, and this universalism of the nation. At least a polity to be able to still exist had to become a nation. And so the consequence of that is that only the polities who had the same dimension, power, riches, who were able to resist to each other could remain polity and a nation. And so the others, at least I think there is a kind of struggle for life or of the different polities. And so at least it's very interesting to say that, at least every community with an awareness of having the ability to act collectively with a common descent, past, identity, language can be a nation. But in practice, just these which were strong enough could remain nations. And I think that it's also an interesting this encounter between the contingency and progressively the emergence of a kind of norm, which now is very strong. The state nation now dominates not only Europe but the whole world. So it's a very interesting development.
I think something that we didn't perhaps explore as much as we might have done. We started to explore it towards the end of the conference, and clearly there's only a certain amount that can be fitted in, but I think it is an interesting question, is whom the nation encompasses in the Middle Ages. We discussed a paper this morning where it was suggested that in Hungary at the end of the Middle Ages, the nation is essentially a community of nobles meeting in assemblies of estates, and that case was very persuasively put. Clearly, it can vary between different parts of Europe, but I think the question of who are the nation and does the answer to that question change according to context? So are peasants part of the nation when they're paying their taxes or dying in the King's War and not part of the nation at other times? Is an interesting question. I think how this relates to gender is an interesting question. Is the medieval nation essentially a community of men? It would seem odd if it were. I'm thinking of Cosmas of Prague and Cosmas's story of the origins of the Bohemian people and how the early Bohemians are warned against subjecting themselves to a man, aren't they, by Libusa, but they do so nonetheless. They go to the peasant Przemysl and subject themselves to a lord, and that, in a sense, is a departure from the Garden of Eden. They're taking lordship, they're taking hardship, they're taking physical coercion upon themselves as they enter this kind of male-dominated political community. Medieval nations have female names: Germania, Bohemia, Francia. We talked about the language of stereotype and how some nations are stereotyped as male, other nations are stereotyped as female, the warlike Germans, the peace-loving French, and so on. It seems to me that there is both a symbolic question around who encompasses the nation and what kind of identity the nation has, relating to issues of gender, and also very real material questions about whom the nation encompasses, who gets to play part in the nation, who gets to speak for and about the nation, who's regarded as being in the nation and under what circumstances, that potentially provides fruitful material for a whole new conference.
Yeah. Coming from another research interest of mine, I also work a lot on queenship and on economic agencies of queens. And as it is at least in the dynastic and in the noble sphere, which we have, of course, the most sources on, the women are the ones who cross the nations, who are often connecting maybe different nations, which of course brings up the question of border as well, which is not as easy, or it's different in the Middle Ages than it is today. But nonetheless, so this idea of, and we had this in the paper on Hungary as well, when we have then Mary of Hungary, who from the Habsburgs, who is bringing in, because of course she comes from a family, so she brings in her natal family, and some of these natal families is perceived as foreign. But obviously she is then becoming the queen of this polity, and she's not foreign, but her family is. So these overlapping, I think, of kinship and family structures, of connecting, and then of perceptions, maybe of nationhood, of belonging, of how to switch between communities, was very interesting to see. Mm-hmm.
So going back to modern nation state, we always think about modern nation state in terms of, we always think about modern nation state as something territorial. Mm. But as we know very well, in medieval times, we not only have the question of burgeoning territoriality, but also of the dynastic identities, or the ways in which polities were linked or detached from with their dynastic rulers. So I would like to open this question of how did the nation linked to the dynasty and to the territory?
I think it's a very important question, and it speaks to the complexity of the Middle Ages and to the way in which, as we were discussing a moment ago, the nation can provide a window on and a starting point for talking about other kinds of community and other kinds of connection. There was a British political scientist who a little while ago wrote a book in which he tried to distinguish between everywhere people and somewhere people. He was analysing the culture of contemporary Britain and arguing that on the one hand there are highly mobile, highly educated elites of graduates who are at home in any part of the world and connected via social media to their peers across the globe, and on the other hand people who are very rooted in place and view the world through the lens of place and a very concrete sense of home. It seems to me that the Middle Ages also have their everywhere people and their somewhere people, and the dynasts are the everywhere people. When great dynasties set up their coats of arms in the late Middle Ages, they display a pictorial history of their ramifications and their many branches and their connections through blood to families on the other side of Europe. So, for example, John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster in late 14th century England and a potential candidate for the throne, sets up his arms in glass in church windows, showing his links to the dynasty of Castile and Leon. He's an everywhere person. He's an international aristocrat, speaks French, moves comfortably in a world of transnational aristocratic chivalry. In 1381, the peasants of Kent rise up and they accost royal officials on the road because they're angry that John of Gaunt is about to usurp the throne, or they think he is, and they say, "We will have no king called John, and they are referring back to bad King John of the early 13th century, King John of Magna Carta. So John of Gaunt is an everywhere person, and the Kentish peasants are somewhere people. They are looking at their own community. They are looking at what they regard as oppressive rulers of times past, and suspecting that those bad times are coming again in an age of heavy taxation for the French wars, and they pick out this dark figure from English regnal, we might say national history, and say we're not having someone like that again.
To pick up on this point, I just recently published a book chapter and made this argument how in the 16th, 17th century, in the case of depositions, the inhabitants of a realm choose to have a specific dynasty, and it was associated with a specific realm. And it wasn't thinkable to say, we don't want this king, we just take someone else from some random dynasty, but it has to be the dynasty which is connected. And it's kind of like, oh, we want to have a monarchy, we don't have a specific dynasty in mind, we just take any dynasty. That's a very modern thing. Usually then they take some royal or someone with royal blood from a German dynasty in the 19th and 20th century. But I found it very strange because I saw this in the 16th, 17th century, and I think this is also something which resonates with 1381, how the supposedly powerless, the ruled, can actually influence and can say, no, that's who we are, this is our nation, and to our political community, to our territory, belongs this specific dynasty.
I think that maybe also the Czech case can be an interesting example. Bohemia was ruled a long period by the Przemyslids from the beginning of the duchy in the 9th century until the 13th century. And so when the Luxembourgs arrived in Bohemia, it was quite problematic to be recognized, because I think that the idea of the naturalness or natural dynasty is also something which is very important. At least the dynasty is also something which binds the community together. And Charles IV, who was he was emperor, so quite a strong ruler. At least he developed two strategies. The programs he dictated, which were designed for Europeans rulers, connected the line to Charlemagne. It was very important for this discourse, but for the Czech public, he proposed something different. And so he divided, at least clearly, he was the product of two different lines, because his mother, was Eliška Přemyslovna, Elizabeth Přemyslid, so he could connect to the Přemyslid line. But what is very interesting is that he didn't try to mix the two. He had really two parallel discourses for two different audience, and he knew that for the Czech audience, Charlemagne was not an important figure for the Czech historiography and the Czech imaginary. So he knew that the most important for him, it was to connect to Saint Wenceslas, who was really the main figure of the Przemyslid dynasty. And what I wanted also to add is that in the Chronicle of Dalimil, which I worked a lot, so this chronicle is clearly pro-nobiliary. It is a critique not only towards the Germans, but also against the development of this new kind of government when the duchy became a kingdom. And so he criticizes the arbitrariness of the ruler and the fact that he's not collaborating anymore with the community, and it means the nobility. But what is very interesting is that in this text, still, the dynasty is very present. Almost each chapter starts with the name of the ruler or the succession, and it's not just a question of sedimentation, because it's true, it's something, because all these chroniclers were working on the basis of older, so he just took up a model which he made himself, but it's also that at the dynasty is also something which is embodying statehood. And it's not just the power of the king, but it's really this kind of frame for the development and the realization of statehood.
I think we had some very nice examples from the Low Countries at the conference about how this overarching concept of dynastic statehood could work, but also the complexity and the local perspectives that could be embedded within it. So some of our speakers talked about the dynastic state developed by the Dukes of Burgundy in the 14th and 15th century. And the Dukes of Burgundy are very interesting in this context because they are younger sons of the French royal family. They are figures of huge importance on the European political stage. And between the mid-14th and the late 15th centuries, they establish an enormous composite state running north-south through Western Europe, from Holland, Zeeland and Flanders in the north to Burgundy and almost the French Alps in the south. It's a huge agglomeration of territories, and all these territories come to have in common the Dukes of Burgundy as their lords. But as some of the speakers made clear, the subjects of the Dukes of Burgundy, when they expressed their loyalty to the Dukes, as they are required to do, they do so not to the Dukes as Dukes of Burgundy. Well, their Burgundian subjects might, but their subjects in Flanders or Hainault receive the Duke as Count of Hainault or Count of Flanders. So if we imagine this huge, complex armorial that the Dukes of Burgundy have with all their territories, the White Lion of Flanders and so on, all incorporated into it. When the townspeople of Mons in Hainault assemble in the town square to swear allegiance to the Duke, there is a rich panoply of heraldry there, and the visual language of identity is, again, something that we talked about, and we could potentially have talked about even more. But it's a visual language of heraldry that speaks to the people of Hainault and that inscribes the link that binds them as an ancient community with their own sense of history, their own imagined and mythologized past to this dynastic ruler. And we had very nice images in the conference paper of a chronicler from Hainault climbing up a windmill and looking out across the real, lived, experienced, familiar landscape and building that landscape into his narrative of identity and familiar places and a common past, and the complex ways in which those local landscapes and local senses of identification could fit into something as large and complex and composite and dynastic and everywhere as the Valois Duchy of Burgundy is, I think, one of the really striking insights into the workings of late medieval identities and political culture that the conference shed light on.
If you could have one last word on what struck you the most during the conference.
Here's mine. Medievalists can't stop talking about identities. One of the big challenges that I thought Eloise and the other panel chairs mastered extremely well, but it clearly was a challenge, was just to get people to stop talking so that we could fit everything in that we wanted to fit in. And that's, I think, its own kind of testimony to the way in which this subject matter energizes medievalists.
As an early modernist, I was really, really thankful that we couldn't stop talking about it, and it was extremely inspirational, and now I have to find time to think about how the government and political structure and framework and the nation do not really overlap, but I have to think about much, much more, which was really surprising for me, because that's what we expect from the modernity coming, and it just isn't so.
Eloise?
What was very strong in this, during the papers delivered during this conference, was really this merger between contingency, how concrete situations emanating from very concrete groups or who just want to get more power or more, at least led to something which is still present today. I think that for me it's the most, not surprising because I had already an idea, but to see how it's repeated, that it's just used by some people and at least it became this huge idea of a nation with which we have still to struggle or work today.
Yeah, I hope that I speak for all participants when I say that it was a real pleasure to partake in those 3 days of discussion. So thank you very much, Len Scales, Cathleen Sarti, and Eloise Adde. Thank you.
Thank you very much too.
Thank you.
Thank you.